Good afternoon and welcome to today's Baptist Together webinar on church manses. My name is Richard Wilson. I'm the Support Services Team Leader here at Baptist House in Didcot, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Steve. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Steve Wing. I was formerly the Operations Manager for the Baptist Union, and now leading up to retirement I'm the Interim Heritage Officer and Projects Officer for the Union.
So Steve is here because he brings a wealth of experience on church property issues from his time with us. So, and we wanted to make the most of him before he retires next month. So, actually no, not quite next month. Sorry, at the end of April, Steve retires. So anyway, let's move on. So I'm just going to talk about who this webinar is for. This webinar is pitched primarily at church deacons and leaders, talking about what we would see as best practice in terms of operating and managing a manse. It might also be of interest to ministers in occupation of a manse. Please do ask questions via the Q&A panel, which you should probably see either to the right or below the video on your screen. Please, we will do our best to answer those as we see them come in. There will be a recording and probably a copy of the slides available on our website in the next few days once we've got the downloaded recording and processed that. So that should be up soon. So what we will be covering, why churches have a manse, what is a suitable manse, providing a manse, how to go about that, and options around renting or buying a manse, manse property trusts, manse occupancy arrangements, we'll talk a bit about that, maintenance of a manse and how you go about maintaining and operating your manse in day-to-day life, what you might do with a vacant manse, selling the manse, and finally how you might deal with manses in church accounts, because we do get plenty of questions on that topic from time to time. So why do churches have manses? This partly comes back to the tax system, actually. It's long been the convention that ministerial terms of appointment have provision of a stipend and accommodation. And the accommodation is often referred to, because it's linked to the job, it's sometimes referred to as tied accommodation. And the provision of a manse for better performance of duties does not give rise to a taxable benefit. Now, for the better performance of duties is an important phrase, but generally the HMRC will accept that a minister living in a manse in the vicinity of the church and the church where the church congregation live, that will not give rise to a taxable benefit. So that means you can provide a manse and there is no tax or national insurance to pay. If you did instead pay either a higher stipend or a housing allowance to cover housing costs, then that higher stipend or housing allowance would be subject to tax and national insurance. And clearly that is not ideal. It's important to say that the manse needs to be local to the church to qualify. If your church is in, say, Bournemouth and your manse is in London, it's hard to argue that the manse is actually helping the minister to perform their duties. The argument for this provision in the tax system is that the minister is sort of on call to the congregation at all times, and therefore living within the area which the church serves is crucial to the role. So that's why we have a manse. Steve, do you want to just talk a bit about?
Obviously, you know, the needs the manse needs to be appropriate to the needs of the minister and their family. It needs to have things like sufficient bedrooms for the family, usually a spare bedroom for guests. It needs to meet any specific requirements the family have in terms of disability or other accommodation needs. There obviously requirement of a study for the minister to work to enable it to be a place where they can work from home, and it needs to have a suitable number of reception rooms for hosting guests or meetings that the church might want to, or the minister might want to organise.
So it's not necessarily the case that it needs to be the size of a church hall or anything like that, but it does need to be functional as a sort of ministerial residence, and it's important that the manse provided is suitable for these things. So how do we provide a manse?
So the options that the church would face is either to rent one or buy one if they haven't got one already. So long-term settlement requirements is if you're planning to have ministry for a long period of time, it's more likely to be cheaper in the longer term to buy a manse. But if you are looking at shorter-term ministry options, then renting might be more suitable. And we'll cover those sort of two aspects as we go through the presentation.
So you may have, for example, a project where you've brought in a minister, or you're having a handover between ministers. I've heard of that situation recently where a church temporarily needed two manses, but was going back to one when the original minister was due to retire. So in some of these circumstances, renting may be the more suitable option. Most typically churches will buy, but that's not necessarily the only option available or even the best option.
And also tied into this suitability, it's also what actually can the church afford. So if your church is able to raise a 30% deposit or more, then obviously you've got more options about the purchase, certainly through the Baptist Union Loan Fund, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. What monthly amount can you afford to pay in terms of rent or loan repayments is going to be crucial as you work through this process. And a big bonus, I suspect, is that remembering that charities are exempt from stamp duty, land tax. So if you do tend to opt for the purchase option, then you're saving a significant amount of money that you won't have to pay to HMRC in that acquisition.
But you will have to, for example, budget for fees and any acquisition costs, and potentially with owning your own manse, you've got higher maintenance costs, of course, because if you rent something, then the landlord is responsible for a large amount of the property maintenance. So these are issues you need to face into. If you obviously don't have any cash for a deposit, then it's going to be hard to raise the finance to buy a manse. Typically, you're looking at a more commercial mortgage than a consumer mortgage, and so you're typically looking at higher levels of deposit than are available to individuals. So just be aware that you will need to have access to a reasonable amount of cash if you're buying a manse from scratch.
Okay, so if you're of the view that you need to provide a manse and are going to potentially buy the property, then you need to, as a church, agree the budget. You need to look at what loans might be available, and clearly the Baptist Union Together Loan Fund would be a good place to visit, and certainly the Loan Fund officer, Tim Chowns, would be happy to talk to you about that. And there's likely to be a need for the church as a whole and the church members to agree to make the purchase at a special church members meeting. So you need to, if you like, get an agreement from your membership that this is the right way forward.
It's worth just touch on the loan fund. We do help several churches each year to purchase a manse to support them in buying a property that's necessary to enable them to have ministry. So please do give us a call if that's of interest. I think that we believe the terms we offer are reasonably favourable, but there are other forms of finance available. So
when on this purchase of the manse, the next step would be really to engage with your minister or potential minister about seeking an appropriate property, and then agreeing through the agent a price. At that point, then you probably would then be needing to think about appointing solicitors, because once your offer has been accepted, the agents will want you to nominate your solicitors to act for the church and also the church's property trustees in the purchase. We would suggest that most churches would find it helpful to talk to the union solicitors, Anthony Collins, because they have specific expertise in that area, but of course that is a choice for the church to make. It's
worth saying that if a church chooses not to appoint Anthony Collins, and they are using the Baptist Union Corporation as property trustees. We'll talk more in a minute about what a property trustee is, but Anthony Collins would need to act for the Baptist Union Corporation as in their role as property trustee.
So you've got.
So it's usually most cost effective to have one solicitor doing both jobs. So we believe Anthony Collins are competitive for this. The part of the challenge is because there are specific requirements on a church as a charity, distinct from an individual purchasing a property. There is some importance in having charity solicitors involved. So we have seen churches think they can do it cheaper and find that actually isn't always the case. So we would recommend reasonably strongly that you appoint Anthony Collins if you're going down this route.
So once you've agreed the price, the agents have issued their heads of terms and you've appointed the solicitors, the next step would be to get what we would recommend as a home buyers report. This is a mid-range report that will identify potentially any problems, which you would then perhaps need to follow up with other surveys that might be recommended. And of course, at that point, then you may need to look at the costs of any remedial work and again, renegotiate perhaps the price to take into account those additional costs you might have to bear.
And it's worth saying here that as a church, if you're buying a house as an individual, I know often you will take up a home buyer report or similar. Sometimes you can take a sort of pragmatic view on some recommendations in the report, think actually that's not such a big issue for me, I think I can fix that myself. One of the challenges you have as a church is you are effectively a landlord, and you need to think about your responsibility to the minister and their family as occupants, and perhaps you have a more regulated expectation of what you want to do. So just ignoring recommendations in a home buyer report is unlikely to be wise. And so it's probably a more serious thing than maybe obviously important as a home buyer, but sometimes this is a more serious issue for a church than it would be for an individual.
And then the last bit of the process is really agreeing the exchange and completion dates to allow time for the church to make any improvements it might need before the minister comes into occupation, and also to resolve any issues that might be around in terms of what extra provision the minister and the family might need prior to occupation.
Yes. So you can get into some complex projects around extensions and like that, and we won't go into all that detail, but you do need to work to the fact that presumably you have a timeline that you're trying to work to in terms of having the minister operational and on the ground. So anyway.
So the alternative to that is, of course, the renting option, and providing a manse for renting. Again, it needs to be agreed by the church as a suitable outcome, and also look at a suitable property within the budget of the church. The recommendation we have is that if you're a standard church that's an unincorporated association, then two of the leadership teams should be nominated to be the principal tenants within the renting. We don't recommend it to the minister because obviously that creates a lot of conflicts in terms of their occupancy and also them being in the arrangement. But both of those people would need to be clear in their documentation that they're acting on behalf of the church when they enter into that rental agreement. So the rental agreement is in the church's name, but these two people stand instead, mainly to do the right to rent checks that they will have to go through and the due diligence that the agents will look to comply with.
Yeah, and it's important to say here that the rental agreement really does need to be in the name of the church, and the church needs to pay the rental cost, so the deposit, the monthly rent. If it's paid by the minister and you reimburse the minister, then that reimbursement is going to be subject to tax and national insurance. And that's when you're talking about a rental that might be £1,000-2,000, maybe even more if you're in certain parts of London. The tax and national insurance liability, both income tax, employers' national insurance, and employee national insurance, it can actually mean that in order to give the minister a net £1,000 to pay rent, you might actually have a cost of nearly £2,000 by the time you've grossed up the national insurance and income tax. So really important that any rent is in the name of the church and paid by the church to avoid that liability arising. So, one option that people have looked at and does work in certain circumstances is if a minister already owns or wishes to purchase their own choice of property in their own name, it is possible for that to act as the manse. Particularly so, for example, if the minister has a strong desire to be on the property market, and also maybe the church doesn't have the sufficient cash resources to buy a manse, this might be advantageous. It really does need to be structured carefully to avoid making causing the same sort of tax liability issues that we had before. Essentially, the minister can buy the manse. The church can then rent the manse from the minister as per, and then provide it back to the minister as their manse. So similar to the previous option of a rent, but essentially the minister is the landlord as well as the occupant. So it's a little bit complicated to get your head around, and it does need to be structured carefully and fully documented. We have seen people try to do this sort of arrangement informally, and the HMRC will generally not accept it. So we're happy to put you in touch with our tax advisor who can help you through this process and has the detailed advice and template documents to do that. So won't dwell too much further on that, but if that is an option that you think is needed in your circumstances, then please do get in touch.
Okay, the fourth, well, the next option I suppose we ought to think about is sometimes ministers and the church may consider a shared ownership arrangement. This might be from a desire from the minister and their family to have a foothold in the property ladder that we've just been talking about as part of their future retirement planning, or the church may have the desire to release funds from the manse for other purposes, and may allow purchases of a larger manse than otherwise thought possible. All of these are concepts and desires are very good in the practical sense, but I suppose that the reality is that it's not something that we currently recommend that churches should enter into. The reasons for that are that it's very hard to put in place if the minister needs to borrow money towards their contribution to find a mortgage in the current mortgage market. It was a thing that was available many years ago, but that mortgage market has really dried up, and there aren't the financial capacities around now to do that. It also presents issues at the end of the ministry. This can cause difficulties over the plan for the property, the valuation, whether the church at this point has the funds available to purchase the minister's share, how short notice the minister needs their share from the property to enable them to purchase another one as they move on. So it creates a lot of tensions within the church fellowship and ministry at that point. So I think it's those reasons more than anything that we feel that these are not best practice at this point.
We really feel we can't recommend this arrangement. We feel too much experience has told us that it has a very high risk of ending badly, particularly at that end of ministry situation where the church and the minister may have very different objectives as to what they're trying to achieve at that point in time.
And the other thing to remember is that in financial troubled times, house prices can sometimes go down rather than go up, and of course at that point there is that issue about how does the charity get to come to grips with the fact that they're losing their share or their value in the share when the minister is wanting to depart. So it's in difficult financial times and property price times, it is even more tricky to realise get over those issues.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what we've just talked a lot about, how you actually obtain the manse. I think the next thing is just about making sure it's then ready for the minister. So, Steve, walk us through this.
Yeah, so when you buy the manse, as we've talked about already, make sure you give yourself enough time to do any renovations or whatever. So when a minister or a family are coming to the property, moving and starting ministry is very stressful, not just for the minister, but sometimes for the church as well. There's a lot of expectation there and excitement. And so you want to try and make the property as welcoming as possible to get the ministry off to such a good start. So the key things there are really to ensure the property is in a good state as possible, decorated and the like. Fit any outstanding maintenance issues that have been highlighted in the home buyers survey. As I said, make sure that all of the decoration internally is well done and in an advance of occupation. Ensure any major items that you might need to address, which may have been identified in the home buyers report, such as changing kitchens, bathrooms, improving heating and flooring, electric lighting, roof guttering, etc., and windows, have all been dealt with before the minister and the family arrive, because it gives then the ministry a great platform to move forward.
And it's much easier to do those jobs when the manse is vacant. It's also probably just worth saying that actually it can get the church and minister relationship off to a good start. Yeah. Even just nice touches like a bunch of flowers and a box of chocolates waiting for the minister on arrival can set the right tone in that start of the ministry. So do have a think about that. It can also be great fun as a church getting together to work, potentially have a working party to do things like fix the garden or perhaps do some decorating. It's a balance as to strike what you might spend on professionally and what you might feel you're able to do as a church. But yeah, it really can help when people are often quite excited about a new ministry starting, that you can mobilise volunteers to help. And I know in my own church that's happened on a few occasions. So moving on, one very particular issue which we talk about in preparing a manse for occupation is about carpets. It's a very odd issue because unfortunately the HMRC views fitted carpet as content rather than part of the fabric of the building. So they would see the provision of carpets as the minister's responsibility, and providing them and so new fitted carpets when the minister is in occupation give rise to a taxable benefit. And to be honest, the benefit amount is usually quite small, but it's more a hassle in administrative terms than it's worth having. So generally, we would highly recommend that if the carpets are anywhere near needing renewal, that they're done before the minister moves into occupation, and that you buy carpets of a suitable quality to last throughout the anticipated ministry, which might be 10 years or more. So buying cheap nasty carpet probably isn't particularly wise. So I know that's a particularly odd topic, but it's one that unfortunately takes up rather too much of our thought process sometimes.
Okay, so we've talked previously about manses and property trustees and the like. For an unincorporated church, when it comes to owning property, they're likely to need property trustees. That will either be a number of local people or one of the property trust corporations around the country. And so once those trustees take ownership of the property, then there will need to be a suitable trust arrangement put in place to enable you to cover the use and also the way that the church would use that property. We would suggest that most churches buying manses now would look to probably the Baptist Model Trust for Manses 2004, specifically written so that they provide limited constraints on the use of the proceeds of sale that the church might like to use in future, unlike most church trusts, which are very restrictive. Churches that are CIOs, charitable incorporated organisations, or charitable limited companies by guarantee can hold manse property directly. So those issues, perhaps for those styles of church, are less important. But even so, it does make sense to make sure that you ring fence the asset with as little red tape around it as you can, and that's why the Manse trusts are the best model to use.
Just to give you a sense, something, if you're at all unsure, you're almost certainly an unincorporated church, so something of the order of 95% of the Baptist Union's member churches are unincorporated churches. There are a growing number of CIOs, charitable incorporated organisations, and a handful of companies limited by guarantee, and they can hold their property directly because they are what's called incorporated, so they have a legal structure that can hold property, but most churches are not. So if you're at all unsure, the likelihood is you will need a property trustee.
Yeah. So once you've got your property, you've got it held, that some churches and ministers enter into the arrangement and are quite happy to rely on the provisions of the Manse as set out in the terms of appointment. However, there are some churches and ministers that would prefer a more bespoke type of arrangement, and that's called a Manse occupancy agreement. But they're written agreements beyond the normal provisions covered by the terms of appointment, and they just help to clarify sometimes expectations that ministers or churches may have of how the arrangements for the occupation of the Manse will be taking place. They're unusual at the moment, but very likely they're most common where another church worker is actually being appointed and not the minister. But the similarities can be beneficial. So if you are thinking about needing to do something like that, then obviously there is going to be a probability that you'll need specific legal advice recommending how to deal with that situation.
And it's probably just worth saying that where you have somebody who is not an appointed minister and operating in the role of minister, then the tax benefits that we've talked about earlier would almost certainly not apply. So a youth worker or a families worker or certainly a church administrator, if you give them a house, then that will give rise to a taxable benefit. So it will often be questionable as to whether that is necessary or sensible. But it can be the case if you've got a vacant house and they need somewhere to live, that even with the taxable benefit, it's worth doing. So just have but in that circumstance, it's definitely worth having a legal documentation of what the agreements are. So moving on to maintenance of the Manse. Sometimes it's helpful, we find, just to lay out what normal Manse arrangements are. So the church usually pays for buildings insurance. Now that's totally normal for a landlord. A landlord will normally pay the building insurance for a building in a normal commercial landlord or residential landlord arrangement. Some things that we do are slightly different from that though. Water and sewerage bills are usually paid by the church. Council tax is usually paid by the church. Those two are normally those are not normal in the landlord scenario, but they are the normal situation for a church. I should have put probably on here, it's also normal for the church to pay the domestic phone and broadband connection because that is seen as necessary for the Manse as a place of work. And so you can provide those without a tax benefit arising. It can get a bit tricky if you start buying a integrated package that involves TV, because TV is not generally considered necessary to the minister's duties. So you would then have to come up with an acceptable way of splitting that bill. But that's a more complicated, subtle issue. If you want to get in touch, and we can help you through that. Again, back to what's normal for a landlord though, maintenance of the building fabric, fitted kitchen, built-in appliances, bathroom electrics, heating, windows, roof, etc., etc. Those things that would be the building fabric as opposed to the contents are part of the church's responsibility. And that includes external decoration. The bills for all of these things should be in the name of the church and settled directly by the church. And if that's done correctly, then, and it's particular about having the bills in the name of the church, then none of that will give rise to taxable benefit for the minister, either on tax or national insurance. The minister will usually pay for the contents insurance because the contents are theirs, and so it's their responsibility to insure. They will usually pay energy bills, although it can be that some churches may agree to reimburse those. That's one of those items that is there are people who go both ways. If you do reimburse energy bills, then that's usually not subject to national insurance, but is subject to income tax, with the delightful vagaries of our tax system. Ministry is usually responsible for cleaning the manse, so you can't, and the upkeep of the garden, and bills for any of those should be in the name of the minister, and should be paid by them. And if they're reimbursed, they should be reimbursed. I'm just going to get up because our TV is about to turn ourselves off, and we might be losing you if we're not careful. So there we go. Sorry, excuse that slight interruption. So we can still see that the webinar is continuing to work. So bills for all of those should be in the name of the minister and paid by them. And if you do reimburse any of them, then it's liable to give rise to taxable benefits. So if you provide cleaning for the manse, that's liable to be a taxable benefit. We're not going to go into the full complexities of ministerial taxation here, and there are some things that there may be situations where a minister can get some offset against tax by treating the manse as part of their place of work. So we're now going to talk a bit about maintenance manse. Steve, do you want to take us through this?
So it is important that there are regular inspections of the manse, but that would normally be in agreement with the minister, just really to ensure that it is being properly maintained and continues to meet the minister and their family's needs. It helps continue that good start to ministry as well, to enable the continued maintenance of the property. One way you can keep a track of all that is obviously to keep a manse log book that records the work that you may be doing there for the minister, and as part of that, it's also important that you keep any guarantees or warranties that may come out of any work that you do, to ensure that those sort of things are covered and understood by the church as well as the minister. If you are going to do work, then clearly the best charitable advice is that we seek competitive quotes for best value. So it's helpful to get at least 2 quotes for any substantial works you're going to be planning to do. And as a landlord as well, the church would need to ensure that the gas and electrical safety checks and certificates are held for the work that's carried out on those by the church and by the minister. It's important that both have copies of that. And the landlord also should be putting in place policies or arrangements so that things like the gas through British Gas or HomeServe can be dealt with by the minister calling a central emergency number rather than the deacons.
Yeah, so there's a bit of wisdom in here. A British Gas and HomeServe and there are a number of others in the market provide landlord policies, which are designed primarily for commercial landlords but work perfectly well in this scenario, and will deal with things like blocked drains, burst pipe, failed heating, electrical issues. Sometimes, depending on the policy, maybe broken lock or lost keys, broken window. They can be invaluable in terms of just giving the minister the ability to just sort out problems there and then with a third party, even if your fabric steward is on holiday or it's 2 a.m. or what have you. So these organisations are set up, and those policies are not hugely expensive, say £20–30 a month, and can save you an awful lot of hassle. So I speak from personal experience on that one. So certainly in my own church, we have one of those policies in place.
Okay, so I suppose we're moving on to the sort of next sort of section of we've got this manse. What do you do? If you come to a point where it becomes vacant, i.e. your minister has moved on to a new church, and you're in an interregnum waiting for somebody else to come along. So the first thing we would recommend is that you advise your insurers that the manse is now unoccupied. They will have some requirements from their insurance perspective that you would need to meet and comply with to keep the insurance valid. The last thing you want is a burst pipe in the middle of winter in a vacant property with no insurance cover. And then the next thing you probably will need to start thinking about as a church is to consider the future needs. Do you need to retain that for your future ministry? If yes, then perhaps you're thinking of renting it out or keeping it even vacant, even during that vacancy, if it's going to be a short window. If no, do you think you should sell it, or do you want to retain it and rent it out as an investment property? Those are the sort of options you might need to be thinking about as you go into this vacant manse arrangements.
And will definitely all vary depending on the circumstances of your church, and if you're not sure you're going to have ministry in future, then that will drive different options compared to if you think you're recruiting as fast as you can.
Yeah. So if you're thinking about ministry is going to continue and you're looking to move forward with a minister, then obviously the preferred option probably is to rent out the manse. So we would recommend that you always appoint a professional agent to handle the renting of the manse and follow their advice. There are legal obligations that you need to comply with, as well as get best value for the charity. And those legal requirements include such things as right to rent checks, energy performance certificates, gas safety and electrical certificates, and deposit schemes, which are all well handled by agents. But if the church want to do it themselves, then it puts an awful lot of strain on individuals within the church to comply with those sort of things. And we would normally recommend that an assured short hold tenancy is the best route for renting out your manse. But in that, you probably would need to consider the notice periods fitting in with any search for your new minister. So you probably need to give at least 2 calendar months notice on any assured short hold tenancy, and then give yourself the time to check the building again, do the maintenance work you've got. So you're probably looking to end the tenancy probably 3 or 4 months before you're expecting your new minister.
Yeah. So I think it's worth emphasising that the renting a property has become more regulated in recent years.
Yep.
A number of these things that we've just listed on this slide in terms of right to rent, EPCs, gas safety, electrical test deposit schemes, many of those are not actually been around that long. So maybe 20 years ago you might have felt comfortable renting out a property directly. It's much more difficult to do in a compliant manner than it was.
And I think it's important to say that those trends of tightening up those regulations are only going to continue. The government is already talking about increasing the landlord's checks, and local authorities are also looking at those. Certainly in Wales, there is also a need for landlords to register. So all of these things are going to continue to increase, and that's why the agent is probably best placed to support the church through that process.
And agents are also very good at keeping an eye on tenants. That's part of their role, and doing inspections and making sure that the tenant, any damage the tenant does is remedied at their cost, doing check-in, check-out. There are lots of reasons, and particularly when you're operating as an organisation with legal obligations, in the sense that also your obligation to the tenant to make sure the property is safe and well maintained. You don't really want to leave the church exposed to those liabilities. So right. We would highly recommend using an agent, using a professional agent. Take advice from people locally and take up references and agents by all means, because definitely some are better than others. But I think even a not brilliant agent is better than trying to do it yourself in most circumstances.
So if you're deciding that ministry is not anticipated in the longer term, then obviously the next option is potentially to decide to sell a church manse. So if you are looking at that, maybe because you don't think it's in the right place, or it's not suitable, or you don't want to retain it as an investment property, then the church would need to make that decision to sell the manse. Certainly if you're anticipating that your need for ministry is some years off. You may wish to take advice from your regional minister, because obviously the fact that the manse is not there may have impact on any future ministry anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's good to have a discussion with the regional ministry team.
And the regional minister will help you understand whether your manse is suitable for a typical ministry. Obviously, sometimes the church congregation won't necessarily have a good view on what is a typical manse and what it looks like, whereas your regional minister will have seen many and be able to give comment on whether it is an attractive proposition in terms of recruiting a minister.
And I think the important thing is that has to be a decision by the church members, and that through their church members meeting that everybody is in agreement that that's the right way forward, and get their consent to do that. So when it comes to selling a church manse, the first thing we would say is that you probably need to check with your property trustees the details on what trusts apply to the manse. Some older trusts may need updating, but generally speaking, if we are able to have that initial discussion, those issues can be resolved as part of the sale process. And then the next thing would be to appoint a firm of solicitors to act for the church and the property trustees during the sale process. Again, we would sort of suggest that the union solicitors are well placed for that, for the same reasons we outlined when you're looking at buying a manse.
I highly recommend that you do use the Anthony Collins, because I think if you use alternative solicitors, there will end up having to be another set of solicitors involved anyway, to act on behalf of the corporation.
And one thing that's quite specific to a church as a charity is that the normal valuations you might get from from the local estate agent may not be sufficient to allow you to proceed to the sale. So you'll need to obtain a specific surveyor's report in line with section 119 of the Charities Act 2011 regulations, and they revert back to a set of regulations put in place first of all in 1992 for charities that say you have to have a specific type of report to agree to the sale as best value for your charity. And the final thing I think that we would say is that remember that the funds that come from that sale will initially be held by your property trustees until the use is agreed between the trustees and the church that are in line with the trusts that apply. So reviewing the trusts at a very early stage, with the church having a good idea of what they want to use the money for, is really recommended to ensure that can be a smoother process as possible.
And often it's as simple as a resolution is required from the church meeting. It often is as simple as that. So, but if you just know what those trusts are, and if you're in trust with the Baptist Union Corporation and you're thinking about going down this route, let us know, and we should quite quickly be able to give you an answer as to what your trustees say. So we're just going to finish by talking about how to deal with the manse in church accounts. This is a fairly rapid run through. There are more complexity to some of this topic. Just while we're running through this topic, we have had one question on the Q&A, which was about how does all of this work when you have a part-time minister? Unfortunately, the simple answer is it's quite complicated. It depends exactly how they are part-time. So it is quite normal and accepted for a minister who's part-time whilst they're training for ministry. So a minister in training, maybe doing half-time in church, half-time in college. It's entirely acceptable that that's done via, they can have a manse that's available the whole time. If somebody is working in a bank and working half-time as a minister, it can get a lot more complicated. And so we would suggest getting in touch and we'll go through the specific circumstances and work out what might or might not be the best route. Sometimes it can be part-time between two ministry appointments. So there are sometimes, say, staff who are doing a regional or national role part-time and doing a church ministry role the rest of their time. Usually there are ways through that, but it may impact on how that sort of dual appointment works, whether it be two contracts or two or one contract and some work with a lead employer. So before you put those sort of situations in place, please do get in touch and we can walk through what the options are. So I'm sorry that's a complicated answer, but as I say, if you have any other questions, please do put them into the Q&A and we will do our best to address them either as we go or at the end. So it's worth definitely saying in Manse and church accounts, so a Manse is an asset. It certainly should be in the balance sheet of the church. Manses, unlike churches, are usually relatively easy to value. There is a ready market for residential property in the UK. So, usually agents will come and give you a value quite easily, or you can look on various sources like Zoopla or the Land Registry, and that's got some information that would help you value a manse. So there are three main ways you can value a manse. You can have historic cost, which is i.e. the amount you paid for it, plus any improvement costs that you put into it, plus any acquisition costs, and then apply depreciation. So say what the life you think of the property is, how much of the land, how much value is in the land, how much in the building, and then you depreciate the building and you hold the land at the original cost. You can go through more detail on that if anybody wants to get in touch. You've got insurance rebuild value, again, relatively easily available because it will usually be on your insurance certificate. That's a good replacement value for the building, and you can carry the land at original, what you think the acquisition cost, portion of the acquisition cost that was in the land, and you can make reasonable estimate of that. And then a final alternative is market value. The problem is if you follow a revaluation methodology, i.e. go to market value on a regular basis, then at that point you will need an independent revaluation on a regular basis. Regulars usually seem to be 5 years or so, every 5 years or so. Now, some independent, and it comes down to what your independent examiner or auditor will accept. Some of them may accept this methodology using a Zoopla valuation, because that is at least independent, but whether it's up to the standard they feel is appropriate is down to their judgment. This is a probably developing area, but if you need to get surveyors' valuations, then obviously that starts to get, you potentially have fees to pay to get that done. So we would generally counsel that you go with a historic cost valuation with depreciation applied, or possibly an insurance rebuild valuation. Generally, the Manse asset should be in a designated fund. This just helps, well, unless there are onerous trust provisions applying, which may mean that it has to be carried in a restricted or endowment fund, but those would be fairly unusual when applied to Manses. But having it in a designated fund as opposed to the general funds does show that it's not available for general spending. You can't immediately turn your Manse into cash because usually it's an operating asset, as in it's being used by the minister. And if you sold the Manse, then you would have to find another way of providing that. So it's not just the value of the Manse, which might be several £100,000. It's not just money you can lay your hands on. So it's usually helpful to have it separated out in a designated fund, which is often true of what you might call fixed assets anyway. In terms of income and expenditure, so we talked about capital value. Most expenditure were just operating costs stored in the general fund, minor maintenance, utilities, insurance, etc., all the costs that we talked about earlier. However, major capital improvements, say a new kitchen, new roof, windows, should be added to the historic cost and depreciated. There's a bit of a grey line between those two as to what is a repair and what is a capital improvement, and we can talk through that in more detail if you want to get in touch if there are any issues that you want to discuss. Letting income is generally likely to be general fund income, so you can use that for the general expenditure of the church. I guess the only thing I'd say as a point of wisdom rather than necessarily accounting is just, if you're relying on your letting income from a Manse not required for ministry at that point in time, then you obviously are going to have to live without that when it comes to appointing a minister. So you just need to be careful. Also worth, if you are letting out a property, it's worth making sure you have sufficient funds kept back in your reserves, so be impact your reserves policy to ensure that you can cope with any maintenance requirements that might arise. And the same is true to a large extent if you've got a minister in occupation. So, if there were to be an issue with a new kitchen required, or a new windows, or what have you, then you do need to have money set aside for that sort of maintenance. You can insure some risks, such as storm damage, or fire, or flood, or such things. But there are maintenance costs that you will find are just not covered by TRIP, where anything wear and tear related will generally not be. So, some final thoughts. It's worth remembering the Manse is a valuable asset for the church to use in support of the minister and their family. I would emphasise a Manse is an important part of the minister's remuneration package, and it's important that you provide for them well. They are doing an important and critical part of the church's work, and therefore it's important to support them by having a suitable Manse that is well maintained, well looked after, and that they feel cared for through that process as a church. Therefore, keeping the church Manse well maintained does aid the church's ministry. It makes the minister feel valued and cared for, and therefore enables them to do a good job. And often the Manse is used, it's a visible part of the church. There will be people visiting the Manse, and if they see a Manse well looked after, it can give them a good impression of your ministry. There are a series of guideline leaflets about Manses. It's more than several, so please do click on this link or just search in the resources section for Manses, and you will find a number of leaflets in there on all sorts of topics that we have covered in quickly today with a bit more detail. And if you have anything where you want to discuss, you think is a bit more complicated, or some of the issues that we pointed at today, then please do contact us via legal.ops@baptist.org.uk, or give us a call at Baptist House. Always delighted to take a phone call directly. So I can see we've got at least one more question that's come in. So question that's just come in is, if the minister is responsible for the maintenance of the garden, but the church is responsible for council tax, which includes waste disposal, where should paying an additional charge to the council for green waste disposal fall? That's an interesting question. I guess it's down to the church as to whether you're willing to pay the green waste charge. I'm fairly comfortable that you could pay it without it being a taxable benefit, because it does fall within the scope of council tax. It's also the case that I think it would be difficult for the minister to pay separately, because the council is likely to have one council tax account, so it may well be difficult for them to settle it separately. Whether you feel you want the minister to reimburse you for that cost, I think is down to the discretion of the church. It's usually not a huge sum, and I would generally counsel the church not to fall out with the minister over a small sum. I would advise you to cover that cost, because I'm sure it can be done tax-free, which obviously makes it cheaper for the church to do than for the minister to do, because they would pay out post-tax income. And again, it's just one of those issues where it's just probably not worth having a dispute with them, or a difference of opinion with the minister over it. I think it also there's a bit of balance. If they've got a huge garden, then it's probably you in order to maintain the garden properly, it's essential for them to have the disposal available. If it's a city centre property with no outside space and a couple of window boxes, then probably not necessary. So there's just a bit of wisdom in there, but yes, my guidance would be pay that as a general rule. So at this moment in time, I don't think we've got any more questions that have come through. We hope you found that a useful rattle through Manses. It's a big topic, actually, surprisingly large topic, and we felt we trimmed down the content for the webinar, but even despite that, we've run over our usual sort of 45-minute time target. But hope you found it useful. It's always been a pleasure to help you through these issues. But again, If you have any questions, then please do feel free to get in touch with us at Baptist House via either legal.ops@baptist.org.uk or via our phone 01235 517700, and we will be happy to handle your query. I've been Richard Wilson, the Support Services Team Leader, and delighted to have been joined by Steve Wing, our Operations Manager. So if you call in and ask for either of us, we'll be happy to guide you through any of these topics. So thank you for your time. Have a great rest of the week, and we hope that you are successful in managing your church matters. Thank you very much.